On this episode of Civic Cocktail, after a year in Congress, Pramila Jayapal looks to the future, sharing her most pressing concerns.
What is the foreign policy strategy? The majority of communities across the country understand that migration is good for us. Well, I have signed on to articles of impeachment, as you all may know.
And broadening the discussion on guns. We'll talk personal safety.
In the home, you need to have that firearm not only locked up, you need it actually unloaded.
Responsibility.
It's really, really despicable and unconscionable that we have not taken more action sooner.
Legislation.
I'm a responsible gun owner. I don't want a mentally ill person buying a firearm.
And activation.
The answer to gun violence is not by putting more guns in the hands of people.
It's all coming up on Civic Cocktail.
Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Civic Cocktail. I'm Joni Balter. My guest this evening is Democratic U.S. Representative Pramila Jayapal of Seattle. Hi there, Congresswoman.
Hi,
Thank
Joni.
you very much for joining us. The journalists helping with the questions this evening are Marcus Harrison Green. He's the editor of the South Seattle Emerald, and Rebecca Gross, editor of the University of Washington Daily. I'm a Daily alum. So, Congresswoman, let's start with the Dreamers. Several attempts have been made recently to try to fix this, but we heard just this week, President Trump said no DACA deal. How is this going to be resolved, and is it going to be resolved?
Well, thank you, Joni, and it's so great to be here,
Thanks.
and it's so great to represent the 7th District in the United States House of Representatives. As you know, this issue has been near and dear to my heart for a long time. We have been pushing over and over again to get a resolution to a permanent solution for Dreamers to be able to stay in the country. It's not a partisan issue. 80% of the country agrees that we need a permanent solution, but unfortunately we've had 3 bipartisan proposals that have been taken to Donald Trump. He has said no. So when he tweeted that, no DACA deal, I said, well, that's no surprise because he hasn't wanted a DACA deal from the very beginning. He is the one who put these Dreamers at risk and put them at risk of deportation, and he has not been willing to move forward. So we're going to try to bring a bipartisan solution to the House floor.
Can you give us some timing on that? Some of the timing?
I mean, we're going to get back after this week, and I think we'll know a lot more. There have been a number of Republicans that have worked with a number of Democrats, and if we can get enough signatures on a discharge petition, that's a way to bypass the majority and bring a bill to the floor for a vote. And we've even said, bring a couple of bills to the floor, and we'll do what's called Queen of the Hill. Whoever wins, whoever makes it to the top of the pile and gets 218 votes wins. If we cannot do that, then obviously we're looking to the time when Democrats take back the majority, and that's the time we're going to pass this. But that would be a great disservice to our young people who deserve a solution, and everybody in the country knows they deserve a solution.
Well, how much does this have to do with the fact that the border wall wasn't really funded in this budget? Border security was. And you're on the budget committee, so you know this kind of wonky stuff, right?
I'm vice ranking of the budget committee, and the border wall was funded at $1.6 billion, and that was not enough for Donald Trump. The truth is that there were many proposals before that with a permanent solution for the Dreamers that would have included more money at the border, which none of us liked, but we probably might have considered it if there was a real solution. There wasn't. Now, that amount of money at the border is essentially enough money for 30 new miles of wall. And so he was very upset he didn't get his way. And that is why today, after spending the weekend with Sean Hannity and Stephen Miller, he has now been tweeting about sending the National Guard to the border to militarize the border, when the reality is we're actually at the lowest level of border crossings in many decades.
So I was thinking about that, about sending the troops to the border, and I was thinking, so what happens when there's all these stories, news stories, showing troops standing there maybe not having all that much to do?
No, that's right. And actually that happened even with the judges. You know, they sent a lot of judges down to the border to supposedly take away the challenge that we had with trying to get people through the immigration courts and through the judges. And to a faster deportation, in his words, and they just sat around with nothing to do. So we need a permanent solution. And I think the thing that makes me heartbroken about this is not actually an issue that America was deeply divided on before Donald Trump came into the office. And I still think that today, the majority of businesses, the majority of communities across the country understand that migration is good for us, that immigration is good for us, that we benefit from a society that harnesses the talents and skills and helps our communities to grow. And I think the majority of lawmakers feel that way too. So he's playing to a shrinking part of his base, and he's throwing a lot of red meat out there to kind of fan the flames. And it's difficult as an immigrant. You know, I'm one of only about a dozen members of Congress who were born outside of the United States. So I feel like I owe you a special thanks for electing me, because it's a great time for my voice to be there.
So the Seattle Times editorial page had a pretty interesting feature recently where they asked all the members of our Washington delegation what steps Congress should take to protect the investigation into the 2016 election.
Yeah.
Your answer was one of the longer ones. So I thought that I would ask you, what will likely Congress do?
Well, the other committee I serve on is the Judiciary Committee, which has jurisdiction over all of these issues. And so it was a longer issue because we've been talking about it a lot. And we, right before we left DC, had a press conference of the Judiciary Democrats around this, because we're concerned not only if Robert Mueller gets fired, but the other way that this could happen, the same effect could happen, is if Jeff Sessions were to either be shamed into retiring, Twitter fired, you know.
Oh, that's a new word,
I don't know,
right?
I just created it. But,
Twitter fired.
Or
can you be Twitter hired?
He hasn't really done that yet necessarily, but you know. And then what would happen is, in a recess, you could actually get somebody into that position who had already been confirmed by the Senate. That could be, for example, Scott Pruitt, who I don't think at this moment is necessarily the right candidate to talk about, but he's made no secret that he wants to be there. And if he comes in, then there is no longer that conflict of interest that required Jeff Sessions to recuse himself. So he comes back in, he could fire Mueller. So our steps have been, first of all, we need to make sure that we get as much bipartisan support as we can to be clear that if this happens, it is a constitutional crisis, and we as a Congress have to take it on together. Secondly, we need to make sure that the papers are protected. Any papers of the investigation are protected. And then third, we need to make sure that the American public understands all of the challenges, and it's not just the firing of Mueller. It is actually all these other things that might happen that lead to the same result. So
the Republican members of Congress, some of them didn't say much in this Seattle Times feature, but you ride the airplanes with maybe a couple of them. Do you think that they would take some steps to protect the Mueller investigation?
Well, I definitely know that I've talked to some of our Republicans, not from this state, but from other states, and they are deeply concerned about this. But what worries me is that there are really good Republicans on the other side, many of whom I've worked with, but they will say to me in private that they think what Trump is doing is terrible, that he should never fire Mueller, but they won't be public about it. They won't sign on to bills.
That counts
they won't
for voting,
be public,
then
and that counts for voting.
Right.
The question is, if it really were to come to a crisis, what would they do in that moment? Walter Jones has been a Republican from North Carolina. He's also on this other bill I'm doing around forced arbitration and sexual harassment, but he has been public about Mueller's firing. There are Republicans in the Senate who have been public about this. And I really hope that there is a moment where people think not just about being in a position for power, but being in a position for justice. And that would be standing up for our Constitution and standing up for our democracy.
So you're on the Budget Committee, as we've been saying. Can you give us real briefly some of the, it was a crazy, confusing budget that was passed, the way it was passed, all of that. But can you give us a few key items that were brought home to this area?
Look, the budget was actually really great on so many levels for things that we care about in this state and this district. So an increase by billions of dollars for HUD, an increase in our low-income housing tax credit, thanks to Maria Cantwell, Susan Del Bene, others. An increase in funding for LEAD, which I was proud to lead with Jim Sensenbrenner from the Republican side. An increase in child care development block grants, a couple billion for that. Transit funded, the Northgate project is finally going to get funded. Money for electric vehicles and buses. So there was a lot of really great stuff in the bill. However, there was also 16 hours between when we got a 2,200-page bill and when we had to vote on it. So we didn't even have time to read all of the policy riders. We are now finding some of the things that are in there, including regulations around the EPA that are being rolled back. And for me, the biggest issue was a lot of the reason we got what we did was severalfold. One, Democrats really held together and pushed for our priorities. Two, we refused to allow what the Republicans wanted most, which was an increase in military spending. Now $670 billion on defense spending. Pentagon, by the way, is the only federal agency that's not audited at all. But we said, if you're insisting on that, we will at least insist on a similar parity on domestic spending. And so that's why when the Senate had their shutdown, because in large part of Dreamers' courage, like it was all about the Dreamers who were holding it out, the one thing the Republicans didn't want to do was to give us anything on the DREAM Act. And so in the end, the negotiations included a lot of things that we really, really wanted because they couldn't possibly get enough Republican votes for a $1.3 trillion budget. So they needed House Democrats to vote in pretty large numbers. And so that was the deal that ultimately got negotiated. And we just have to recognize that we did leave behind 800,000 Dreamers in this bill. And it was not an easy choice. Leadership in the House split. Nancy Pelosi voted for it. Steny Hoyer and Joe Crowley voted against it. 77 Democrats, including me, voted against it, even though we worked so hard to pass it, because we have got to have some clarity and some stand around the Dreamers and being able to fix that problem for the long term. But we should be clear, there are some really terrific things for our district. And so at least for 2018, we managed to pull off probably the highest funding levels for our budget in adjusted terms since 2010. So we're finally back at 2010 levels on adjusted funding. Now we go into 2019, where the budget year is just about to end for 2018. We're just finalizing a budget. 5 continuing resolutions, even though the House has control of the House, the Republicans have control of the House, the Senate, and the presidency, but they can't govern. They couldn't pass a budget, even with majorities in all of those chambers.
So if Congressman Norm Dix was the congressman from Boeing, that would make you the congresswoman from Amazon, which is in your district. What do you make of the tiff between President Trump and Jeff Bezos, the Washington Post? What do you make of that?
Well, Trump has hated Amazon for a long time, and I think that came out in many interviews that he's done with Vanity Fair and with others. And I don't think there's a strategy around most of what is happening. I mean, if you look at trade and you look at tariffs, I think tariffs can be useful if they're part of a strategy. What is the foreign policy strategy? What is our trade strategy? How are we actually engaging between global and domestic production? But there is no strategy. And similarly, I think with Amazon, I think, honestly, he's angry about Jeff Bezos and the Washington Post. I think that's much more of what's
mad at the media?
What's going on there.
I don't get that.
And so that is clear. And then I think that Danny Westneat had an interesting column in the Seattle Times yesterday. I mean, there's certainly things that we need to think about in terms of how do we make sure our businesses, which are so valuable to our economy and to our communities, are really partners in everything we're trying to create.
But what about that? Because, I would like to know first, and then second, so does Amazon pay enough tax locally to sort of account for the footprint that they've put here locally?
That's a big question. I don't know. I haven't, those numbers that I saw from Danny were the first time that I had seen those numbers.
But then that's very important. Are they paying it? They're paid no federal income tax according to that
And there's
story.
a lot of bills that we're considering in judiciary around how you tax internet sales, because this is a whole new arena. And we have not really kept up in terms of the amount of sales that are done over the internet. And so, I think that there's a lot of complaints in Seattle, as you know, about increased taxes, another tax here, another tax there. And frankly, the district I used to represent in the state Senate, the 37th district, one of the more affordable places in the city, we are kind of taxing people out of being able to live in their homes, because you do have value in your home as it gains value, but you don't gain that value until you sell a property. And so fundamentally, I've always been a fan of actually looking at our whole state tax system and really figuring out how we reform our tax system so that everyone's paying their fair share, but we don't have a lot of nickel and diming with 100 taxes that end up hitting people that maybe can't bear it the most. And so we need a whole reform of our tax system locally. And then at the federal level, look, the Trump tax plan, which benefited a lot of big businesses, including some that are in our state, transferred $1.3 trillion of wealth from middle-class working families to the wealthiest corporations in the top 1%, and boosted our deficit. This year it will be at $1 trillion. So we have a lot of work to do to really figure out how we incentivize businesses to keep jobs here, to be able to contribute, so that we can have transportation systems and education systems that benefit our corporations, so that we can graduate people out of community colleges and actually have the skills that they need without $80,000 of college debt. So there's a lot of issues for us to take on, and that's why I ran for Congress.
I'm going to bring in Rebecca Gross.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much. And, as being sort of a representative from not just a journalistic perspective, but also from the university perspective, I was wondering, we were talking about the budget. Is there any room in the budget sort of shifting around terms with higher education, universities? How is this going to be affecting UW and other state universities?
Great question, and a lot that really benefits the university. Everything from increase in funding for a lot of our research and NIH funding, which the university gets a lot of that funding. $300 million for the loan forgiveness program, which is a lot of UW alums that are saying thank you. More funding for a lot of our higher ed overall. Patty Murray was really instrumental in that in the Senate as well, both K-12 but also higher ed. And so I think that we are seeing a lot of funding continue. It's not going to address this issue of economic sensitivity, which I recently talked to some folks in DC at Catalyst Institute who said that even more than party now, people are voting based on the level of their economic sensitivity. And so that is, how much medical debt do you have? How much does your health care cost? How much do you pay in student loans? How much is your housing or child care costs? And 62% of Americans in this country cannot accommodate a crisis that costs $1,000. 62%. So you think about that and you understand why there is this deep sense of economic insecurity for people and how they go to bed at night and how they wake up in the morning, and why people are looking for something that rewrites the rules of the economy completely. Not incremental change, but something that is going to shake it up. Whether or not they agree that it's all going to be good, they want something that is going to actually bring them a different model of existing.
Yeah, so outside of the Mueller investigation, our current president obviously constantly seems embroiled in scrutiny. Recently, there was a specter that was raised of a potential campaign finance law violation with alleged hush money paid to for an alleged affair. Now, while due process obviously has to play out, is there anything that would come to light that you could see some scenario where you would seriously support impeachment for our president?
Well, I have signed on to articles of impeachment. As you all may know, Stephen Cohen on Judiciary Committee from Tennessee has drafted a set of articles that are very thoughtful and really go to the constitutional issues. We get 300, in 15 months, we've gotten 300,000 pieces of mail, letters, phone calls. So thank you. You are the most engaged district in the country. And the number one question I get is, why haven't you impeached him already? Like literally the number. And so I have to explain to people, and it's great because it means people want to understand how our democracy works. But you can't move impeachment articles unless you have a majority that supports that. In Judiciary Committee, we have not even been able to have hearings. And we are the committee of jurisdiction. Until recently, every committee of jurisdiction in both the House and the Senate, except for the Judiciary Committee in the House, had hearings around the issues of the emoluments clause, conflicts of interest, all of the issues that have been at the front and center around Russian interference in our elections. And we have not. And so the excuse that was given by Chairman Goodlatte was that the Mueller investigation was occurring, and therefore we needed to wait for the investigation to play its way out. Now, of course, it's getting a little too close to home, and so in Judiciary, they have started turning this around. So a resolution of inquiry that I introduced around a hearing into these issues that you're talking about, Marcus, turned into an inquiry into Hillary Clinton's emails. They literally took it, replaced the text, and then passed it out of committee as an inquiry into Hillary Clinton's emails. So, this is some of what we're dealing with, and I think it is why elections matter. It's why engagement matters, and it's why what happens in the next 8 months matters.
Audience question.
Representative Jayapal, welcome home.
Thank you.
And I'd like to ask you to share with your neighbors here at least one thing that you think your President Trump has done well over the last year. And I appeal to your supporters not to go too hard on you for being nice to the president. And why didn't the Democrats care enough about today's DACA recipients to fix their situation when they last had the chance?
Thank you for the question. Actually, Democrats did pass the DREAM Act through the House when they were in control of the House. It did not pass in the Senate, and it did die with the support of some Democrats. So I take your point that we need to do better as a Democratic Party, but I will tell you that if you brought a bill to the floor, it would pass with 100% Democratic support. And that we know because 100% of Democrats signed on to the discharge petition. To your first question, I'm glad that President Trump signed the budget deal. Good for President Trump.
As you mentioned earlier, you know a lot about immigration from some of the earlier work you did in Seattle. What do you think will be the impact on the immigrant community of the citizenship status question on the upcoming census? If it stays there, there are lawsuits, the city's involved, the state's involved. But let's say it stays. It's a super important question. Gary Locke and I wrote an op-ed on this, saying how terrible adding a question about citizenship to the census would be in terms of getting people to participate. When I was at One America, Joni, I used to go out and work with the immigrant communities to get them to understand why people were coming to their door and why were they asking all these questions and what was the importance of participating, because $700 billion in federal funding gets apportioned. Our districts get apportioned based on how many people actually fill out the census. And so there's so much that matters out of the census. Plus it's used, by the way, by businesses to project sales and a whole bunch of other things. So if you ask this question, my belief is that people will refuse to participate and they will be afraid. And this is a tactic, a naked political tactic, in my view, to depress turnout for the census in critical
blue states and blue districts across the country where there are a lot of immigrant families and mixed families. I think it will backfire because I do not believe that it is only blue districts and blue states that will be affected. I think there are a lot of places in Georgia and Alabama and Arizona and Iowa and Kansas that have huge numbers of undocumented immigrants and immigrants in general who are in mixed status families who will end up seeing their funding also go down. So I think it's very short-sighted. I have asked for a meeting with Wilbur Ross. I led the minority caucuses, the tri-caucus, and writing a letter about the effect of this. And I really hope that they understand that this is a terrible idea. And of course, Bob Ferguson and Eric Schneiderman and other attorneys generals are taking this to court as well. So that's another avenue for us to challenge this.
Yeah, there seems to be a cacophony of claims about fake news across the political spectrum. How accurate is the national reporting that we're reading? Somebody who's inside.
Well, I think that the biggest challenge I see is that people don't know what to trust anymore. And so there is no trusted source of news for most people unless you have whatever your favorite is. Like I will go to the New York Times and the Washington Post. Of course, those are the targets of Trump. He will go to Fox News. And there are people in this country who really do believe that every other form of media other than the one they're watching is fake news. And there is clear evidence in my book. I'm sure there are people that might disagree with this, but there's clear evidence in my book that a lot of what gets put on Fox News is not researched at all. It's just put out there. It's not accurate. And that now we don't, and I saw this in Olympia too, by the way, everything moves so fast that reporters, first of all, have decreased news staffs. Joni knows all about this. Decreased news staffs. They can't cover stuff as quickly. And so they sort of go with whatever is available to the best of their ability. And news travels really fast. So I think it's a real problem because a lot of people will go to the internet, see a story, not necessarily check the source, not necessarily look to see if it's real out there, and then follow that. I just don't agree with Trump that it's some of the best reporting sources in the country that are the fake news. That's who he calls the fake news. And I know the standards for some of these journalistic efforts.
What do you say to the students in the room? We have some students here who are on the next segment of this show talking about school safety, gun safety. And so they have watched a lot of interest after the Parkland shooting. The president, Congress, all hepped up and ready to go do something about it, and then predictably punt, not really achieve much. What do you say to them about their efforts?
Well, Rhiannon, who is one of our incredible leaders and our young people here today, we had a town hall with the students, and I said to them that I am just so inspired by what you're doing. I'm so inspired by these leaders across the country who are they're not just looking at this from a very narrow perspective. I mean, I got to meet with the Parkland students as well. I got to do a town hall with our leaders in this state. I got to meet with the Parkland students in DC. They are not just looking even at mass shootings. They're connecting mass shootings to everyday violence. They are connecting it to racial justice. They are connecting it, they're saying don't arm teachers with guns, arm them with books and pencils and resources and supports so that they can do their jobs in the schools. So it is a much bigger issue even than just the Parkland shooting. And they are incredible organizers. I mean, when David Hogue took to calling out Laura Ingraham for his horrible comments and essentially forced an economic boycott of her show. It was brilliant. And so I'm really inspired, and I think that they have done a tremendous amount. I think we are at a turning point, if not a tipping point, for gun legislation. So it has now become an issue that is and I want to say thank you to the Alliance, to Grandmas for Against Gun Violence, for all of the groups that have been working on this for so long and are now rallying together to support this moment that we have. But we did pass a few small things in the budget, tiny. And now the real question is, can we ban high-capacity magazines? To me, that's one of the most important things we need to do. Can we pass background checks? Critical issue.
And we have to leave it there. I'm out of time. We have been catching up with Congresswoman Pramila Jayapal. We're going to be back soon to discuss the impact of school shootings on our lives and on our students. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. We are back to talk about school shootings and gun safety. We're here with Rhiannon Rasaretnam. She's a senior at Tahoma High School and one of the lead organizers of the March for Our Lives in Seattle. We have Patty Hayes. She's the Director of Public Safety for Seattle and King County. State Senator Phil Fortunato, Republican from Auburn. And Renee Hopkins. She's the CEO of the Alliance for Gun Responsibility. Rhiannon, I'd like to start with you. How did you get involved in this gun movement, and what do you expect to achieve?
Yeah, so I have a little sister. She's in 6th grade, and I believe for a long time that she and other students should not have to worry about their safety when going to school and while they're at school. And so when I heard about the March for Our Lives being planned in DC, I knew that this was the time to act. And so when I went on Facebook and saw that there hadn't been a march event created for Seattle yet, I decided that it was time to make one. And Amelia and I, who's the other co-founder, decided that this was something that we wanted to take on. And so we had a lot of fun organizing it, and we made sure that the passions of us and other students could be heard by people around the country to show that we would no longer tolerate the inaction of Congress and other legislators.
Patty Hayes, I read a stat I wanted to share with you and with the audience. Since 1999, more than 187,000 students have experienced a shooting at their school during school hours. What do you know, or what do the studies or the science show us is the impact on students and on their learning?
Well, I'm so grateful to be here and to represent public health, and to be here with Rhiannon is just inspiring for me. What we know about the impact to students and student learning is that when you are under toxic stress, when you experience fear and the inability to feel like you can know what's going to happen to you, that affects your ability to concentrate. You get the rush of adrenaline. Think about a time when you were in something like the emergency room. You were sitting there, you were getting instructions, maybe you were there with the family. We know from the literature that you get home and you don't remember half of the stuff you learned, right? Think about it from the student's perspective. They're there to learn. They're affected every day when they cannot concentrate because they're watching the windows. They're thinking about what's outside. So it does impact, and we're watching that impact over time with these students, Joni.
My producer says to the audience, a little less clapping so we can get through some of the material here. Senator Phil Fortunato, you were a no vote for several gun safety proposals. Some of them passed, some of them did not. Do you think our gun laws right now in Washington State are about right?
Well, first, let me just say, I'm getting a feeling based on the last interview that this is not a pro-gun, pro-Trump crowd. I just have that feeling. Okay, so, I mean, basically, part of the problem that I see with some of these gun bills is they're symbolism over substance. They don't do anything. We heard, a big deal about banning high-capacity magazines when the kid in Parkland used 10-round magazines. There is an estimated 20 million AR-15s out there. Okay, now I happen to think it's just a scary-looking gun. It's no different than any other gun. It just happens to be ones that people choose to use. But that means everybody that has an AR-15 has at least five 30-round magazines. That means there's 100 million magazines already out there. So if we ban AR-15s today, ban the sale, so you can't buy this scary-looking gun anymore, and you ban high-capacity magazines, You have 20 million guns already out there, and you have 100 million magazines out there. So how long would it be before you have any effect if you did that today? And the other thing is I want you to point out, you said some of them didn't pass. I want you to think about the fact that how extreme some of these bills were, because they couldn't even get them past a Democratic-controlled Senate, a Democratic-controlled House, and the governor to sign it. So if they were that reasonable, how come the Democrats didn't vote for them?
That's a perfect segue for me to ask Renee. Hopkins, what did happen in Olympia this year? Can you tell us, a state like Vermont, Huntington State, was able to pass a whole bunch of gun safety laws. Washington, not so many.
Well, let me start with what happened that was positive. We passed more gun legislation this year, gun violence responsibility legislation this year than ever before. 4 bills passed and have now been signed by the governor. One dealing with domestic violence, loophole, and access to firearms. Another dealing with some important clarifications around our CPL process. Bump stocks, which Senator already referred to. And a final one that's really important on suicide prevention.
Banning bump stocks.
I'm sorry, banning bump stocks.
Okay.
Right.
Okay.
And then the fourth one, which is a really important suicide prevention measure that would allow an individual who knows that he or she suffers with times of feeling suicidal to voluntarily waive their firearm rights, so that in a time of crisis, they won't be able to actually purchase a firearm. And in Washington State, that is so important because 75% of our firearm deaths are suicide. It's an epidemic in our state, and it's something that we need to take really seriously. Now let me talk about what didn't happen. On February 14th, we had a bill that would raise the age on semi-automatic rifles in order to purchase to 21 and require a state-level background check, which is just comparable to what we do with pistols and concealed pistol licenses at this time in our state. That bill died in a democratically controlled, you're right, Senator, committee in the Senate on the day of the Parkland shooting. That was unacceptable. And so what we're faced with at this point in time is a realization that while we have a democratically controlled House and Senate, we do not have a gun responsibility House and Senate. And I want to be
Does
really—
some of that have to do with folks sort of guessing who's in trouble in the fall or who needs to not have a scary vote on their record of some sort?
It absolutely does. And I would say very strongly that our elected officials need to worry more about passing effective legislation when they're in office than about whether they're going to be reelected their next race.
Senator Phil, what gun laws would you like to see? Any new gun laws would you like to see?
Part of my problem is I'm a responsible gun owner. I don't want a mentally ill person buying a firearm. I don't want felons buying firearms. Now, you heard the talk about the enhanced background check. Well, that's all well and good, but what they call an enhanced background check, which currently doesn't exist, is simply notifying State Patrol about you buying a firearm, in addition to notifying the next FBI check. And my question is this: why isn't the State Patrol reporting to the FBI the things on a state level? We had this Parkland—
Okay, but could you also tell me if there is a new gun law that you would support?
Well, yeah, I would support mandating that the state of Washington communicate to the FBI to be put into the background check additional felons, like the guy in Texas who shot up the church. He was a felon. He shouldn't have been able to buy a firearm. We have a mentally ill kid that shouldn't have been able to buy a firearm. It doesn't do you any good to do a background check if there's nothing in there to check. I want that reported to the FBI to be included in the current background checks now.
Renee, you have a personal gun story that affected you, that got you involved in this. Would you be willing to share that with us?
Sure. I lost my 14-year-old brother in a school shooting in Moses Lake, Washington in 1996. And I think one of the things that's so disappointing about where we are today is while the discussion has definitely moved, and thank goodness for the youth in our state and in our country right now that are pushing the adults to move the conversation even further, it's it's really, really despicable and unconscionable that we have not taken more action sooner. And I think finally we're feeling the groundswell around our country and demanding it, and demanding what the voters have been asking for years. Our elected officials do not reflect the will of the people, and that has to change.
Okay, if I could follow up on that.
Briefly, because I got...
Briefly,
yeah.
I represent the 31st Legislative District. I got 110 anti-gun emails and 1,670 pro-gun emails. So I represent my district. I probably would not get elected in Seattle, but I represent my district.
Rhiannon, I wanted to ask you, sort of how do you folks keep your momentum going? You folks have done some marches, you've done some school walkouts, but everybody knows that change is made at the ballot box. Do you think folks your age, enough of them, understand that voting is the way that you affect change?
I think that our civic education is lacking in Washington, especially because for me, graduating with, you only need, I think, a semester of a civic course in order to graduate high school, which is not nearly enough to learn about your role in society and how you can impact it. So first, I would like to see changes in our education system so that kids are growing up learning about how important voting is and being civically active in other ways. And so what my organization is trying to do, the March for Our Lives Seattle, is work on voter registration and work on voter education and try to catch these kids that are turning 18 before the midterm elections this year, and ensuring that not only are they registering to vote, but that they are educated about who is running for office. And then the third part is making sure that they're actually turning up at the ballot or at the poll stations in November, because it doesn't work if they just register to vote but then don't turn out. And I know that the 18 to 21-year-old bracket is historically one of the lowest percentages for voter turnout. And so what we're trying to do is turn that around, and we're trying to, again, catch those kids that are turning 17 and 18. But what I would like to see in the future is systemic change in our education system to ensure that these kids are growing up learning about their importance in society and not thinking that they have to wait until that moment that they turn 18, that they now have a political voice and that they now can make an impact.
Patty, can you tell us briefly about the gun storage proposal that the city of Seattle and King County are working on? How would it work?
So Public Health right now does a program that's called Lock It Up, which is an amazing partnership with the gun dealers and with so the stores as well as the Alliance. And what it does is it's an education so that families who everybody wants to protect their children can get a free lockup box or a reduced price lockup box so that we can safely store firearms in the home. Because one of the key things is that in the home, you need to have that firearm not only locked up, you need it actually unloaded. And so we're involved in that education process. Great response from the retailers on this. And I think the more we get the information out to families, the more important they see to really secure this.
Question is for the senator. After the Parkland shooting, you joined our president in proposing that teachers be armed to, in a way to mitigate school shootings. I believe the proposal that you put forth, a teacher would have to undergo de-escalation training, a psychological evaluation, and some form of weapons training. Do you believe that there is significant support for this approach at the state level?
Well, first, that's not what the bill does. What the bill does, it's only 2 paragraphs. It says, the Criminal Justice Training Commission shall develop an active shooter response training program for school districts to use. That's all it says. In addition to that, it says, we will reimburse school districts for costs that they incur for this training. So in effect, people are saying to me, your bill costs X amount of dollars. It's taking money away from teachers. That's not true. What it's doing is it's actually taking existing revenue or existing money that school districts are using to train people, because they're currently doing this. and it's reimbursing them. So it's keeping those education dollars in the classroom. That's what the bill does. Now, a school district could choose to have an armed response, and there's currently 10 school districts in the state, 6 of which currently have armed teachers and or administrators, and 4 more that are looking at doing that, mostly on the eastern Washington. And then, but you could have an unarmed response. So you would not hire a teacher or an administrator to fix your car. You would hire a mechanic to fix your car because he knows about cars. You would not have an administrator come up with a response for your children in your classroom, Seattle or wherever, to respond to an active shooter. You have to have people that have knowledge of dealing with these crazy people in crazy situations on what to do. And currently I've looked at 2 or 3 school districts and their programs. I would not send my kid to that school, my grandkids in this case.
So do you think there's significant support for it at the state level?
Remember the bill that did not pass your, 6620. That's the bill with the 21-year-old and the ban the semi-automatic, still 21 years old. Frock took my bill and was going to incorporate that. I should have bought a copy of it. He took my bill, marked it up, said administrators, and crossed out the amount of money, said money as appropriate. He would have accepted that as an amendment to his bill to raise the age to 21. So there is, and when people say teachers don't want to do this, that's not true. Because they're calling me, telling me that they would want to. Now, nobody is forcing any teacher who did not want to do this to be armed. Nobody is telling any teacher that should they feel that their school districts. I'm a parent in a school district. I don't want firearms, but I do want a training program that's going to protect my children. I don't want this make-believe stuff.
Moving along, Rebecca Gross.
Senator, I actually have another question for you. The issue of shootings hits home for UW students. There was a shooting on our campus the day that President Trump was inaugurated. I'm just wondering what you would tell to a UW student who is scared to come to campus at the prospect of there being another shooting or something like that happening.
I would tell them to go out and get a concealed carry permit and authorize them to be carrying on campus.
Okay. Okay, audience, question?
Rhiannon, I wanted to ask you a question. One of the many amazing things that your March for Lives group did in 3 weeks was to build alliances with some other youth organizations, particularly Youth for Peace, which I think included a lot of students from Rainier Beach High School. So do you think that kind of alliance is something you will be trying to carry forward into the future?
Yeah, I definitely think that along with the conversation about mass shootings and school shootings, that we should be recognizing that communities of color especially have been facing gun violence for decades, and they face it every single day, but they never receive the national or international attention that the Parkland students have received. So as we have this platform to speak out about shootings in schools, we also want to use the momentum and publicity that we have to also draw attention to students of color that face gun violence every single day and ensure that they are also part of the conversation. And so it was really amazing to partner with Youth for Peace because many of those youth had been impacted by gun violence, and they were able to bring their perspectives to the table, and they were able to share their thoughts at our rally at Cal Anderson. And so that's something we definitely want to continue and grow going forward, is ensuring that students of color have a space in activism and ensuring that their voices aren't being shut out when we're talking about issues that impact them daily.
And Joni, if I can add one thing to this that I think is a really important data point for everyone to know, is that of the deaths due to gun violence, almost 50% of those are folks under the age of 25. So it's very significant to have this discussion and to really have people understand how this is actually manifesting itself in different communities.
Renee, you're shaking your head. I know you want to say something.
No, I just absolutely agree. And I think that the youth movement has done something that the gun violence prevention movement has struggled with for the last number of years. And that is really to push the issue and center black and brown lives into the middle of the conversation, which is where they should be because they are the most impacted. And so I applaud the youth for really taking leadership on that.
So what is the impact of this new energized generation? I mean, and how are they any different? And this is a jump ball for any of you. How are they any different than any other group of young people wanting change? You know, Vietnam War, civil rights.
Well, I could tell you that the youth in my district are attending the April 11th pro-gun rally in Olympia. So you also have people that are avid pro-Second Amendment people that are concerned that this is an attack on our gun rights, and it is.
So I just want to say one thing about that. I think it's really easy to make this a partisan issue, to make this a polarized issue, and for voters in Washington State, it is not. And I think that when we go to these polar sides, which the Alliance is not, we actually represent the center. We represent what people across our state are calling for. In fact, extremist protection orders that was on the ballot in 2016 passed every single legislative district with the exception of one, and it only lost by 2 points there. We literally are representing what Democrats, Republicans, NRA members, gun owners, moms, dad, grandmothers, grandfathers are calling for. And now we have the youth voice to push us along even further.
Rhiannon, I wanted to ask you, if you can vote at age 18, why do you think that the age to buy guns should be 21?
I think that those two actions require very different parts of the brain and are conducted through different processes. So for example, if you are in a state of uncontrollable rage, the damage that you could do with an assault rifle is far, far more deadly than what you could do with a vote. And I think that the students are more than capable, especially at age 18, to know who is running for office, why they should vote for them. And I think our group is trying our best to ensure that the opportunities and information are as available as possible, not to push them in a certain direction, but just ensure that they have the materials available to them so that they can form their own decision and come to a rational conclusion on who they want to vote for, instead of just hearing from their parents or from the news, kind of like the headline topics on who they should vote for, but instead knowing from multiple perspectives what the best decision for them would be. And so that's what our organization is attempting to push for. And so we want to see young voters. We do not want to see young people having access to assault rifles and weapons that can cause massive amounts of damage in just a matter of seconds, because again, having that access to those type of weapons, increasing that access only increases the amount of harm and damage that they can do. And again, I think, by raising the age that allows for, that restricts the access to young people, that if, in case of school shootings, for example, a lot of these students are coming back to their own high schools and committing these acts of atrocities. So by raising that age, that again could cut back on the amount of school shootings that we see.
Okay.
Just a minute, audience question.
So I have a question for you, Rhiannon. Based on what Senator Phil said, he said that he wants to, if I understood correctly, train teachers, because it's teachers who are calling you who want these gun trainings because they know what's best, because they're in the schools, just like a mechanic knows what's best for your car.
Well, first, I don't want to train teachers. Teachers would determine if they want to be trained.
Okay.
And teachers, administrators, or for that matter, the janitor.
Okay, fine. Because teachers are in the classroom, that's your logic. So I want to know from a student in the classroom, what is your opinion on that? Should teachers have a gun training, or how do you feel about that?
I think that the answer to gun violence is not by putting more guns in the hands of people, no matter where they are. And I personally would not feel comfortable at all knowing that one of my teachers, wherever they are in the school, has access to a gun. And I think it's also important to recognize the fact that, again, Black and brown students are disproportionately affected by gun violence, and introducing guns into schools would only increase their likelihood that they would be disproportionately impacted by these guns. And so that's one aspect, and also the fact that, again, from the police officer's side, coming into this scene where they don't know who doesn't have a gun, they could be coming in and the first person that they see pulling out a gun, they're going to assume that that is the shooter, and then they're going to shoot in that direction, and that only increases the likelihood that innocent people will be killed. And so for them coming onto campus and knowing that there's only at least one person with a gun, and knowing that that's going to be their target is far more easier for them to deal with, especially in these situations where a lot is happening at once, a lot of responsibility is being placed on these officers. So I think that adding more guns into the mix would not help their situation either.
Okay, if I can.
Rebecca, wait.
I have a follow-up question to you. So I'm only about 4 years older than you, and I also don't remember a time when we didn't have lockdown drills as a normal thing. It was like, I grew up in California, it was like earthquake drills. How do you think that has affected our generation, either psychologically or in other ways? And what are your hopes for your sister or later generations?
I think that we've become desensitized to gun violence and hearing about it on the news. And so what happened in Parkland was kind of a tipping point for all of us, because not only did we see that these young lives were lost that shouldn't have been, but also that these young people are stepping up and taking action. And again, we no longer have to wait for adults to take action, but we can do it ourselves. And so I would like to see younger students mirroring our actions and growing on them in the future, so that not only in issues of gun violence, but also racism, sexism, the environment, that they will be leaders and stepping up and making a difference in these areas.
Senator Fortunato, I'm running out of time, and I want to ask you something. I know that you use guns, you shoot with your sons, you mentioned to me when we met earlier. And I wanted to know, how do we balance, how do we weigh your right to have guns with students' rights to feel safe at school? Well,
here's my question to anybody here. Somebody walks in this door right now with a gun and starts shooting. Is any of you safe here? Now, from the time that Parkland shooter pulled the trigger the first time to the time the last shot was fired was 3 minutes. By the time the police got there, it was 12 minutes. So everybody that is relying on words on paper to protect your children is living in a fantasy world. You need to have a response in 1 minute. Otherwise, everybody here is saying that they are willing to accept 10, 20, 30, 40 deaths before the police could get there.
Okay,
so that is my question.
Hang on,
that is my question.
No.
How do we respond in 3 minutes? And
okay,
if we cannot respond in 3 minutes,
you have way less than that to ask your question, and the answer has to be tight. We're running out of time.
Rhiannon, keep up the good work. You're doing great. What opportunities in the recent past have you had to exercise the life skill of sharing the spotlight with your pro-Second Amendment classmates? And Senator Fortunato, welcome to Seattle.
For that. Yeah.
I think
just real quick.
I think it's important to recognize that my group and the students that I'm working with are not wanting to take away guns from all people. We're not anti-Second Amendment. I'm actually part of a We the People program at my high school, where we to participate in the Constitution, and we learn about it and we apply it in our everyday lives. So I'm very for the Constitution and I love it a lot. But also I think it's important to recognize that there are certain weapons and certain accessories to those weapons that should not be in our society today, especially as the Second Amendment was formed in a time where those rifles could not do as much damage as they can today. So it's important to recognize the changes are in our society and ensure that our Constitution and our laws also change according to that.
So we have been talking about school safety with Rhiannon Rasaretnam, Patty Hayes, Renee Hopkins, and Senator Phil Fortunato. We'll be back in May with Senator Patty Murray. Thank you so much for watching. Thank you.